Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. In this month's Under the Lens video, I'd like to follow on from prior video discussion we have had regarding both inflation and deflation. I have a different view than those pundits often quoted in the media. I suspect the difference stems from the fact I've been watching both measures closely from an economic perspective for more than 35 years, and prior to that, while employed by IBM at Zenith, consulting to businesses, I experienced firsthand the 1970s period of inflation and stagflation. It has led me to view inflation and deflation as increasingly larger waves washing up against the global economic shore. As such, I'd like to take us through the waves as I see them from both the past and future perspectives. Let me start by making a key observation, that we seem trapped by the assumption that we either have inflation or we have deflation. Why is it either one or the other? It is similar to lawyers speak of asking loaded questions like, have you stopped beating your wife yet? Yes or no? Or agreeing to statements like, heads I win, tails you lose. Will we have inflation or deflation is the same type of entrapping question. The dominant belief is we last experienced real inflation over 2 decades ago, that we have been in a period of deflation since the acceleration of globalization, and we are likely to experience further deflation going forward since central banks appear unable to achieve their long sought after goals of 2% inflation. I would argue we've had and will continue to experience both. They come in ever-increasing cycles, higher levels of inflation and higher levels of deflation, which impact the economy in different manners based on the ever-changing structure of our global and domestic economies and their financial systems. Inflation, labeled in red, has continued to rise, but has had differing impacts as developed economies become more credit and consumption-driven versus savings and productive investment-driven. Meanwhile, deflation, shown in blue, has more recently made increasingly stronger impacts due to the globalization of trade and labor arbitrage. Shown here is where I believe we are in this continuum. Ahead will be the final and by far the most significant impacts of both deflation and inflation. Let's start on the left when we worried exclusively about inflation as global offshoring, outsourcing, downsizing, and right-sizing were only beginning to become everyday expressions, for those at least who are old enough to remember that era. This was more or less the era of the 1980s and 1990s. Inflation, again shown in red, was the primary worry of central bankers, ever concerned with letting the genie out of the bottle and experiencing the inflation of the 70s, where Chairman Paul Volcker had to take interest rates to a stunning 19% in an attempt to get it under control. As such, statistical gimmicks such as substitution, hedonics, imputation, and others were institutionalized to manage its reporting. It worked with indexes such as CPI, making it meaningless then and still today. The impacts of globalization through offshoring and labor arbitrage quickly took hold, delivering the welcome assistance of deflation against the pressures of inflation. We need to take a few moments to talk about the changes that have been made to inflation measures, because they are still with us today and are unknowingly institutionally hidden, or at least unappreciated. The best way of grasping this is through the work of John Williams at shadowstats.com. Shown in red is inflation as reported. Shown in blue is inflation if measured prior to the statistical inflation changes made starting in the 80s. Inflation rose steadily to almost 14% prior to the 2008 financial crisis, before falling to approximately 8% today. Government reporting showed inflation averaging 3 to 5% before going negative during the financial crisis and barely above zero today. You just have to look at your grocery bill, rent, tuition payments, medical insurance, etc. to know inflation is not just barely above zero. Pensioners looking at their COLA increases know how completely bogus this is, as they barely get by on ever-shrinking value of their pension payments and no interest on their life savings to live on. I won't go through the statistical details here, as we did endless podcasts and videos 10 years ago on the subject, many of which can still be found on the Macroanalytics website. Just search inflation or Andros. Even with suspect U.S. CPI inflation numbers, we're now seeing rising inflation expectations around the world as governments pump money like a fire hose at the COVID-19 and its lockdown policy fallout. As we will see in a moment, inflation has more recently shown itself more visibly as asset inflation. One of the reasons inflation has been more visible is because liquidity from the central banks doesn't necessarily create inflation, at least not right away. It is the actual rate of usage of that money throughout the economy in the form of velocity of money that actually turns it into broad-based price inflation. As you can see in this chart, the U.S. velocity of money has been plummeting since the dot-com bubble implosion. Money is in fewer hands and flowing to fewer goods. Most recently has been flowing into financial assets and not the overall real economy. If it did, accelerate that velocity of money. I suspect as fiscal policy moves towards increasing levels of helicopter money, potentially flowing directly to consumers, velocity of money will begin to turn up, and with it a broader based impact on price inflation. Additionally, I need to point out that in this initial wave of price inflation, the economy was fundamentally more capitalist. That is, more money was saved and reinvested into productive assets, labeled here in the well-understood GDP formula as I. Again, as you see, this has changed with advancing waves of inflation and deflation. I generated more money for consumption C, while net exports were positive, adding more money to the economy. This resulted in consumers getting more for less and standards of living continuing to rise even with some level of price inflation. Let's move to the next wave of service inflation and policies of credit expansion. As the U.S. economy saw more industrial corporations offshoring, there was a shift towards more of a service economy. This required more credit. Credit, lending, and borrowing quickly began taking the place of savings. Inflation shifted from growth in prices of goods to those of services such as tuition, healthcare, daycare, rents, etc. Many service categories, illustrated here in red, exploded in price but were not effectively captured in an already compromised CPI formula. Service items were mostly domestic in nature, while goods became increasingly imported. This once again shifted the GDP formula of the U.S. and many developed economies. Government debt, the G in the GDP formula, had to expand to fund economic activity. Government debt resulted in increasing transfer payments, which funded sustained growth in consumption and attracted investment, or I, in the form of foreign direct investments, FDI, to finance ever-accelerating debt levels. Imports soon overpowered exports, and net X soon became a draw on economic growth. As globalization advanced, the use of highly integrated supply chains emerged, which fostered another deflationary impulse shown here in blue. We then saw the next wave of inflation and deflation, with the asset inflation I mentioned earlier, intended to and resulting in policies directed at increasing the wealth effect. Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke was forced to specifically target Federal Reserve policy towards creating further credit through the wealth effect, because credit growth was becoming more difficult to create since available lending collateral was becoming problematic because of the degree of financial hypothecation being used. It is our belief that now, due to the global demand and supply shock of the COVID-19 pandemic policy actions, that we will soon begin feeling the next deflationary wave associated with and due to impeding and slowing global trade, bankruptcy, supply disruptions, excess fixed cost burdens, and balance sheet encumbrance, amongst other reasons. The developed economy's GDP formula is now being forced into a regime change of massive and unprecedented monetary and fiscal deficit spending for bailouts and economic stimulus. Monies flowing towards bailing out and the subsidization of failing zombie corporations, the destruction of small businesses unable to survive pandemic lockdowns, and industries such as transportation and hospitality presently are being completely crippled. Consumers are getting less and less for more and more, while standards of living have stagnated or are falling as the result of these policies, further increasing inequality to levels not seen since the Gilded Era. As we outlined in prior videos, we are transitioning to an era of stagflation as a result of the first global recession in the modern era, with the resulting broadening of policies of modern monetary theory, helicopter money, and the increasing socialist objectives such as guaranteed minimum income. What this means is the government will become increasingly dominant via debt monetization. Consumers most likely will increasingly witness receiving what the government determines, awards, or rations. Standards of living will likely become increasingly universal, except of course for government officials and the crony capitalists. If we are not extremely careful, Mussolini's marriage of government and corporations, which he labeled fascism, may become an eventuality for many countries, including the United States. Many believe that is already occurring or has occurred. This sort of economic structure never survives, as it inevitably leads to hyperinflation. Many fail to understand that hyperinflation is a currency event. Inflationary effects are a result of a loss of confidence in the currency. As the currency falls, everything denominated in that currency requires more of it for the same transaction. The other thing most fail to appreciate is that of the 51 well-documented examples of hyperinflation that have occurred, they were all very rapid and short-lived before the collapse of the overall economy, often measured in weeks or months, but seldom lasting more than 8 to 12 months. This is the final stage of a failed fiat currency economy due to policies of unsound money. Though I mentioned that the next wave is deflationary wave due to the impact of supply and demand disruptions to the global supply chain from the pandemic policy responses, we will see ever-increasing inflation levels. Inflation can be expected to rise as a direct result of new and unexpected forms of taxes. Significant rising federal, state, and local taxes in the form of federal and state income taxes, state sales taxes, local property taxes, license fees, tolls, surcharges, etc. The cost passed through of pandemic impairment costs, the policy costs of unprecedented regime change, the costs of weakening dollar on imports. What we need to understand is that the die is cast. We will have both inflation plus deflation impacting different areas more than others. Where we are headed is a road well traveled. We are transitioning between waves as monetary and fiscal policies changes as consumers and investor confidence decline, leading to an inevitable fiat currency failure or hopefully a new global Bretton Woods agreement that restores sound money and a viable capitalist system. As I always remind you in these videos, remember, politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading. Make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2020 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. And I sincerely thank you for listening.